Joining me on the podcast today is Chris Seller, an aviation expert with decades of experience in navigating and implementing technology changes to meet the changing needs of travel. As Australia moves towards the opening of international borders, our thoughts are turning to what international travel will look like and how it will take place. Facing a world at different vaccination levels, differences in vaccine recognition, a myriad of rules on quarantine, and the ever-present question of travel security, what does the future of travel look like in a post-COVID environment? And how does technology and infrastructure need to change to make it happen?
You're listening to Smarter Cities, discussions on urban life and how it's changing around us, with Jason D'Souza.
Chris Seller, welcome to the Smarter Cities podcast.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me, and lovely to talk to you today.
It's great to see you. It's been a fascinating period of time here in Sydney. We're at the end of our lockdown period, hopefully out very soon, and I think we're seeing a new wave of optimism coming over us. You were just telling me about life on the beaches. It sounds to me you want to get rid of people from where you are.
I want everybody back in the office as soon as possible.
Well, look, it's great to be here. I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of travel. I noticed today Qantas gearing up very much, saying their planes are going to be ready to fly. And I think a lot of us who have been used to travel, and a lot of people who are used to Australians travelling, have found this last couple of years quite taxing, sort of not being able to leave or see family interstate, let alone internationally. So I think it's a really important time to be talking about how airports and technology and infrastructure is going to cope. So it's great to have you here. But let's start with you. I usually start these podcasts with a bit of, why a person becomes an expert in a particular area. So you've had a fascinating career. I'm very keen to understand what got you into this. How did you end up as an aviation expert?
Well, interestingly, I didn't actually start in aviation. My first job when I left school was as a cartographer.
Oh, really?
And I wasn't very good at it. And the insight that I got during that period in how technology could change the way work gets done got my interest in technology going. Cartography was a mix of art and technical aspects, and the technical side of that activity I could see being very quickly replaced by computation and computers. So I went off and did my computer science degree, and during that period of time, I answered an ad in one of the papers for a company that was looking for somebody with a cartographic background and computer science. It was pretty serendipitous. That company was Data General, and they don't exist anymore. But I worked with them for about 5 years as a software engineer, building software for geographic information systems.
Wow. Okay.
When they folded, I then, through my contacts at university, joined Westpac, and that started the part of my career which was in finance and banking. It's interesting going into that sort of environment because banks have very large-scale technology systems, high transaction volumes, lots of customers and that sort of thing. So the challenge in that environment is scale. Towards the end of the 90s, I moved across to Qantas. One of my colleagues at Westpac had gone across to Qantas, and I followed them. And the similarities between the systems was quite remarkable. Again,
between banking and aviation.
Yeah, just from a technical perspective, large scale technology, high transaction volumes, distributed systems. But that really was when aviation got into my blood. And I worked at Qantas for about 15 years, had a lot of very interesting roles there. In fact, I was part of the team that's set up Jetstar in the mid-2000s, and that was when I really got to understand how aviation worked, and you got to see the foundations of a new airline, what went into thinking about how networks worked and how technology supported the business, and particularly from the economics of it. I left Qantas in I think it was 2011, after I'd sort of reached the role of the chief technology architect, and went back to Westpac, and spent another 5 years at Westpac, and got to see how things in that 15 years had changed with technology, how technology had advanced. Cloud computing had become a big thing. Automation was much more on the agenda, and mobile computing and other impacts on the way the technology systems at banks worked. I then left Westpac in, I think, 2016 and took up a role in Canberra with the nation's air traffic control organisation, Air Services, as their CIO. And spent the better part of 5 years working there, getting a very good understanding and grounding in how the air side of the industry worked.
Because that's right, you would have seen both sides then.
So I've seen it all. I've seen the airline, I've seen the airport, and I've seen the airspace management. So I've had
It's funny, I was listening to a discussion today about a guy who is the biography of Peter Thiel, who came up with PayPal and Palantir. And one of the great statements, famous statements Peter Thiel had made was, if you look at air travel, we really haven't progressed at all in terms of airspeed since the 50s and 60s. In fact, the average speed of airlines has slowed, and that's true. We don't have Concorde anymore, for example, right? For a variety of reasons. But to say then that technology hasn't evolved in aviation actually isn't correct, because if you think about it, air travel in the 50s and 60s was almost unaffordable for the average person, whereas today it is very affordable, at least it was pre-pandemic, very affordable. You can travel on a Jetstar, you can travel internationally in economy for a very competitive price, and that is due to technology. One of the big pandemic issues is, I suppose, how what was becoming an increasingly connected and an accessible world through travel has now been stopped because of border closures and for quite legitimate reasons to stop the spread of the disease, which none of us have in any recent time have experienced before. I think aviation's probably been the most impacted by COVID than perhaps any industry. And I think the steering image I have in my mind is the last time I traveled internationally was to Hong Kong last March, and landing into Chek Kok, there were just planes parked everywhere on runways, and they were ahead in the COVID experience before we were in Australia. And it was at that moment I realised sort of how much trouble we were really going to be in when I could see all these planes parked everywhere. What's been the impact on the industry? I mean, you've been watching it closely, you've worked both sides. What's been the impact, and is it a lasting impact, do you think?
Well, the industry's suffered many sudden shocks. Since its inception over 75 years ago, and basically the industry's made no money in that time. It's a very difficult industry to make a profit. I think there was some stats that came out recently from the International Air Transportation Association, who represents, as the lobby organisation, represents the world's airlines, and to put a sort of dollar figure on it, they're estimating that in 2021 the global aviation industry will lose about $40 billion compared to 2019 globally. So it's been a significant downturn, and the airlines are really struggling. Every aspect of the industry is struggling. If passengers aren't flying, airports aren't earning money, airlines aren't earning money. It's an impact on staff. It's an impact on everybody. And I think this current downturn has been worse than we've ever experienced. SARS was difficult. 9/11 was very difficult, but the COVID impact has been more protracted and has had a greater impact than any of those. But people and the industry are very resilient, and it tends to bounce back pretty quickly. So when the opportunity comes to fly again, people will want to get back on an aircraft. I mean, I know myself that I'm very keen to get back to the UK and see my daughter. So the first opportunity I get to get back on a plane, I will. And my wife works in the luxury cruise industry, and they're seeing very, very strong forward bookings for cruising out.
Another industry very impacted by
very impacted
generally. Very, very impacted. I mean, it's interesting. I think you don't realise how important something is to you until you don't have it anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so I think domestic travel international travel, the ability to go anywhere in the world quickly. For many people, it's been a shock to not have that available to them anymore. And you see Europe opening up, and certainly my colleagues in America telling me they're going city to city and how grateful they are to be doing it after a period of time when those of us in business travel were like, oh my goodness, I've got to get on a plane again. I don't think anyone will be complaining for a while, being able to go and visit people. And I do think it's interesting that in the early stage of the pandemic, when we all went on to video conference and started engaging with one another that way, there was a period of novelty, I think, with that. And now more and more people I speak to are saying, I miss the actual human interaction of speaking to one another, meeting one another, having dinner with one another. Because that's how you create new things. I think generally that's how you create new things. So I certainly think as we look from an Australian perspective at, our how things are going in the UK and in Singapore and in America, and how they're learning to live with this virus. So that's certainly a pathway we're going to be going on. Travel is going to play a big role in that.
Definitely the leisure travel industry will return pretty quickly. I think it's interesting, though, from a business perspective. I think businesses have actually learnt to use remote technology and remote working, and I don't see business travel coming back at the same pace, if ever. And I think what we've learnt with technologies like Zoom and WebEx and that sort of thing is that we can remote work very successfully, and businesses can sustain that sort of technology over long periods.
I agree. I think particularly when the normal corporate travel argument is over 3 hours or whatever it is, it's business class, and the business class fare is 3 times what an economy class fare is. Why would I need to spend that unless I really need that travel? So it goes back to your question around the financial sustainability of the airline industry, which it's fascinating, really. I mean, one of the arguments I've read about the aviation industry is there's too much competition in the sector, which is sort of competing away all the profits. And part of the reason is that you have state-run airlines and state-propped-up airlines, which carry a national significance and national importance, and therefore they are protected industries. And so therefore you have protected airlines versus sort of market competing airlines, and that sort of ends up competing away all the profit, which is probably not one for this discussion, but fascinating.
I mean the structure of the industry is a very interesting one. It's another podcast, though.
It certainly is. That's a good segue. Let's go into post-COVID world. So we're all looking forward to opening up and travel. So I was thinking about this on the way here. It seems to me that the technology aspects of travel and the technology aspects of infrastructure always seem to be reactive, right? So, with the tragedy of 9/11, we saw intense security, body scanning equipment. I remember the whole debate in Australia about this sort of really intense body scanning being very, very important, and we put that in. You saw that all over US airports. With SARS, I'm from Hong Kong originally. SARS was a big deal. We had integrated temperature checking everywhere in most Asian airports. Across Hong Kong in particular, and China, at railway stations, you had this as well. It's not just airlines. What do we think the reaction to COVID is going to be? I definitely think there's going to be an overreaction because the airline industry doesn't want to be shut down again. The cruise ship industry, the railway industry, no one wants to be shut down again. Are we going to overreact again? What is it? Are we going to overbuild?
Well, I think it's interesting you mentioned the 9/11 scenario, because I don't know if you remember, but at the same time in Australia here, Ansett failed.
Yes.
And we had a double whammy. The industry was really hard hit. Qantas was repatriating Ansett customers from all over the place. We had major shutdowns in the industry in the US and Europe, and it had a long lasting effect, subdued the capacity in the industry for quite some time. Interestingly, in 2007, I was at a technology conference, aviation technology conference in the US, and Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State, was a keynote speaker, and he gave his assessment of what had occurred in the US aviation industry. And he said when he was in the administration, he had to mandate changes to the way security worked in US airports. And at the time, it didn't impact him personally because he would have special entourages that would sort of whisk him through the airport.
He's not the sort of guy that would line up at
and he didn't have to line up. But when he became a private citizen, he said he was shocked at the impact that those changes had made to the industry, and how difficult it was for people to get through the airport security check experience, and the long delays that had occurred and the disruption that had occurred. And at the time, he said what he was hoping that technology would drive a more efficient, more frictionless process for passengers in an airport, maintain the security and safety aspects, but do that in a more efficient way. And I think the industry's been working on that ever since 9/11. You roll forward to where we are at COVID, a lot of that work has suddenly become very urgent again. And that's what we're actually seeing. And I think that's what we're going to see post-COVID. You're going to see a lot of that investment in R&D in innovative ways of managing passengers through airports and through the travel experience start to come into play. And we're actually seeing it now in many of the airports globally.
Let's go into some specifics. What do you think will happen? How will the travel sort of experience change? So I remember, for example, traveling around the US, around just after 9/11 happened, a couple of years after, and you're right, it was a terrible experience. I looked on my boarding pass. I had a particular mark on the boarding pass. I'd been randomly selected for specific checks. And it was a very manual check. They come and check you, they check your bag, whatever. Wasn't really a lot of technology involved. You still had the body scan thing, which was not available in all US airports at that point. But from a technology perspective, there's been a lot of R&D around all of this, and there will be a desire to keep air travel as sort of open as possible. Are there particular things you envisage are going to come in to change the way we do this?
Yeah, I think we're seeing them now. So the big areas of change will be around biometrics, for passenger identification and contactless servicing in the aerodromes. So what we're seeing is an enormous amount of effort being put into building the capability for governments, airlines and airports to use biometrics to identify passengers at scale and get them through the airport experience in a paperless way.
So what is that, a fingerprint?
Facial recognition, facial geometry, iris scanning, facial geometry. It's mainly facial geometry is a technology
so
that
it scans you at the beginning, and then it scans you at the other side, or does it scan you through?
At various waypoints through the airport. As you go into the terminal, you'll probably get scanned. There is a number of airports that are doing. Doha, for instance, does that. They look for people that shouldn't be coming into the airport. People with records and that sort of thing that they don't want there. Then as you start to progress your way through, you drop your bags, you do your check-in. Uses facial recognition, biometric facial recognition, and sort of it eliminates the need for the use of paper documentation like passports.
Well, I was going to say, do you need a passport then, right?
The problem currently is that if you're in a geography or a country where that has become the norm, then it works really well. But at your arriving airport, if they don't have the same capability, that's where it becomes problematic.
Yeah, and I want to get to that. But before we get off the technology response, what about touch? So obviously you've got facial recognition that will get you through each way. If you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, prior to the sort of alpha variant, I don't remember all my variants, but I remember the first thing was, you've got to sanitize your hands, right?
Yeah.
That's a big deal. Don't touch anything, right? Then, masks became mandatory in most places on public transport, for example. Yeah. Do you think those things, those are not technology solutions, but do you think those are permanent features of airports now in terms of hygiene, cleanliness to avoid,
Yeah, I think bugs? They'll definitely be permanent features. There are a number of airports that are deploying thermal monitoring, fever monitoring. It's almost a mandatory at airports now to check people's temperatures as they work their way through the airport. That sort of technology will become a permanent feature. Hopefully, it doesn't raise too many alarms in a post-COVID world. Most people hopefully will be healthy and work their way through the airport experience relatively unscathed. But that definitely will be a permanent feature. Kiosks that do fever.
So, I mean, remember in SARS, if you had a high temperature, you were sent to a room. Fortunately, I wasn't one of these people, but somebody I was traveling with was. And you had to wait for a few hours and then they kept temperature checking you until they were sure you weren't suffering from something.
Yeah.
Is that what we're looking at in a COVID scenario?
Yeah. What's
interesting? At quarantine rooms.
I think that's an option. You could be denied entry to the airports in a way. It's interesting. Istanbul Airport's doing a lot of very interesting things. They actually are now doing rapid COVID testing. So if you show up at the airport, you're not vaccinated passengers, can't produce a recent negative test result, they'll do it on the spot.
Right. They're using rapid antigen.
Yeah, rapid antigen testing, and they can apparently do about 12,000 tests a day. They're almost a pathology lab in their own right now. So that will become the norm in the post-COVID world.
So thinking it through, I mean, you're looking at Qantas, for example, saying you must be vaccinated to travel. You have a COVID certificate that, as Australians, we all have on our phone now, which is a great innovation. Does that mean now they might actually end up testing you before you get on the aircraft? I mean, the US is quite strict about things. Remember, you have an extra security check if you're on a US flight. I wonder whether you might actually get a rapid antigen test going onto a plane internationally.
That could happen. It's an expensive process for the airports and the airlines to do that. I mean, you would think that they would sort of push that back to the passenger to do that themselves before they arrive. And the last thing you want is someone arriving at an airport that's COVID positive. But that sort of thing will start to appear.
But it's going to happen, right? It's going to happen. Yeah. You are going to get COVID positive passengers. I mean, you think of the case numbers overseas are still substantial, right? In the thousands per day. We are less worried about them because of the high levels of vaccinations in some of these places. But, I don't want to speculate, but in Australia, while our case numbers are where they are right now, as we begin to open up, they will inevitably rise.
Yeah.
And so, in the current world we live in, if you have a COVID positive case, pretty much you close ranks around it. But you can't possibly do that if you're an airport. You can't close down every few minutes. You raised the cost structure here, which I think is fascinating about this, because I remember when we went through the security era after 9/11, there was a big debate about who pays for all this airport infrastructure that the government, effectively as the regulator of airport security, was putting into place. And the airports were passing that on to the airlines. The airlines inevitably had to pass it on to the consumer. But there was a price elasticity of demand for airline tickets. So the higher they became, the less people demanded them. And so all of a sudden, airlines ended up being on the receiving end of losing money because they had high airport access fees, high airport security payment fees. They were also paying for quarantine officers. They were also paying for whatever else. Do we think that the cost structure of airport infrastructure is going to change substantially again now with COVID technology? Do you see that happening? And do you think the airlines are going to be part of that solution, or will they fight back?
It's always been a tension between the airlines and the airports.
So I asked the question.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a tough one to predict. Or definitely the costs will rise in some way as the airports have to implement these new technologies. I mean, contactless technologies in an airport is going to require quite a bit of refit activity, and they're going to have to remove their old technologies, their old baggage handling systems, their old kiosks, and replace them with systems that don't require any touch. Biometric cameras, contactless RFID kind of.
Remember the online check-in that used to go? That's all gone, right?
Yeah.
Can't have that anymore.
You can't have that anymore. So definitely there will be a cost of refit. Some of the airports, they'll just absorb that as part of their infrastructure renewal. But it's always a tension between the cost of the fulfilment part of the transaction for the customer. So the customer's relationships with an airline, they buy a seat to go somewhere, and the fulfilment aspect of that happens in the airport. And it's always been that tension that the airline wants to have the cheapest fare possible and the cheapest experience through the airport as possible. But the airport is the fulfilment end of the transaction, and they need to provide that hygiene guarantee for their passengers and provide the right technologies for their passengers.
Why does the cost structure for the airport, why is the tension so much more evident in some jurisdictions than others? So if I take an example of Chek Lap Kok in Hong Kong or Changi in Singapore, these are very, very advanced airports. They're constantly renewing. I noticed Hong Kong put out a statement the other day saying their air conditioning system is now carbon free, or I think I got that right. So there's constant investment going on. And then you compare that with, say, some American airports, which are, very difficult to get through and, are clearly very old, or, why is the cost structure different in some jurisdictions than others?
I think it's just a scale thing. It's the volume of traffic that goes through the airport. It's also the way the government sees their airports.
I think it's that way, isn't it?
Yeah. It's often a brand thing, particularly some of the Asian airports like Changi and Hong Kong. Just look at Doha Airport, which is just won the 2021 Star Trek Airport of the Year award. It's phenomenal. Wow. The investment they put into that airport is well beyond what you'd imagine the economics of it.
And then you compare that to LAX, and
you compare it to
yeah. I try to avoid LAX when I can. So I think that is really going to be one of the interesting facets of airport infrastructure generally, because there's really three elements, isn't it? There's the first is getting to the airport part.
Yeah.
In Australia, we've spent a lot of money on the getting to the airport part. In Sydney, we've got the WestConnex motorway and the gateway being built now to get to the airport faster. Melbourne, we finally have an airport rail link being built because we're recognizing that Australian cities need excellent connectivity to their ports in order to be an internationalized city, in order to be a trading nation. The same goes, we're talking about airports here, and I notice our background here of a terminal building, which I think is Heathrow. But the same goes for ports, right? Whether, you look at the Port Botany rail line duplication right now, all to make sure we get, the flow of people, goods and services happening more often. And I just find the whole governmental overlay of this in terms of investment quite interesting, because you're right, some jurisdictions pride themselves on being a high quality infrastructure nation, like Singapore or Hong Kong or Tokyo, and others, like the United States, have sort of decided that that's not actually a priority, and there are other things that are a priority. Now, of course, now you see President Biden talking about a $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill, but only some of that is actually for hard economic infrastructure. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's just a really interesting debate that I think is coming.
Yeah, and that I think the post-COVID world will actually drive a lot of that investment, just through the necessity of people have to be moving around in a hygienic environment. You can't have the old technology providing that kind of service. Just like 9/11 created the security uplift in all the American airports, COVID will create the hygiene and the health uplift that's required in all of the airports globally. It'll be mandated by governments. It'll be mandated and required by passengers.
But inevitably will drive the cost up.
And inevitably drive the cost up to some extent.
I mean, one of the interesting things I've been thinking about as well is what is the relationship between primary infrastructure and secondary infrastructure? And the first place I went to was, well, there won't be a need as much for secondary infrastructure because the cost structure will be higher, people will travel less, there will be a psychological safety question around, is it safe to travel? And so maybe you'll find some smaller airports, smaller train ports falling away.
Yeah.
And then I sort of start to think, well, actually, is that really the case? Because I think one of the things we're seeing now is we were pre-pandemic a highly globalized, highly integrated world where our supply chains were almost just in time. And you started to see, as the pandemic bit, chip supply questions. Oh my goodness, we don't have enough chips, semiconductors. Then it was like raw material questions. Car plants had to close down. Now in the UK, you've got energy questions that are happening. They can't get fuel into the UK for a variety of reasons, one of which is the pandemic. And so there is this idea now that maybe as the world adjusts to this post-COVID environment, we're moving from what was a just-in-time supply chain to a just-in-case supply chain, which then means the relationship of airports, and we've talked largely about passengers here, but airports, ports, railways actually changes completely now to being one more integrated with the supply chain. Is that something that resonates with you?
Yeah, I think that's from an airport context. It's an interesting concept. I think if you think about the supply chains, one of the things that sort of worries me a little bit about supply chains is the fuel, the amount of fuel that we store here in Australia. Something like 20 days of aviation fuel.
I know, it's frightening.
It's a frightening scenario. And
then our strategic fuel reserve is stored in the United States.
Yeah.
Which I've never really
understood. And we actually don't even comply with our treaties with the US when it comes to there's a requirement on us to store a certain amount of fuel, which we don't do because we use that just-in-time fuel out of Singapore.
What is the reasoning behind that? Why? I mean, given the size of our country, we have space to have a strategic fuel reserve. What stopped us from doing this?
I don't know what's stopped. It's something I don't think gets enough attention.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been a problem.
Yes.
Until probably even with COVID, we haven't really experienced a fuel problem here in Australia. I think if we have a bit of a dispute somewhere in the South China Sea, that might change people's opinions about how that gets handled.
It's quite topical at the moment, really, isn't it? I do think. I mean, it's funny. John Anderson on his podcast has been talking about this issue a lot. Interviewing different former military personnel and whatever else, raising it as an issue, because I actually think it doesn't have to be an act of war or something else that disrupts the supply chain. In this case, it's a health emergency that disrupted the supply chain. And in the case of the UK, that could happen here, right?
Yep.
There is something that's happened in the UK that's caused fuel shortages. They're now suffering as a consequence of it. And the Prime Minister's saying the problem will be solved by Christmas. So they're going to be in this sort of period of time with sort of higher energy prices till Christmas.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine the public are going to respond to that.
They're not going to be happy.
And it's not just in Europe. I mean, in the UK, China is now experiencing energy shortages as well, right? For a different set of factors.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this then comes back to the freight and logistics supply chain, where airports play this big role. And I know there's going to be a change in the cost structure and how passengers move. I'm convinced there will be a freight implication here as well, and I haven't quite thought through what that is yet.
Yeah.
But I think there is definitely a technology element to that too,
yeah,
as to how all of that gets managed.
Yeah.
And airports are going to have to understand that, and freight and logistics operators are going to have to understand that.
Yeah, well, freight and cargo for an airport is a very important revenue stream.
Is it true airlines make most of their money out of cargo rather than
well, I don't think it's most of their money, but they can make a lot of money out of their cargo. I mean, it's when I was at Qantas and I used to travel in staff travel, I used to dread being tapped on the shoulder and being asked to leave the plane because there was a weight and fuel balance, and they needed to pick a couple of staff members to get off.
Yeah.
Probably carrying a few lobsters in the belly.
Price of travelling free, my friend.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But if we come back just to the airport environment in a post-COVID world, one of the things, particularly with that, the economics of how the airports operate, there's some technology developments that are happening to help them optimise how the airport actually operates. Recent advances with the way data can be stored, so big data, volumes of data, and how it can be analysed in real time is giving the airport operators some opportunities to think about how the asset of the airport, the terminal asset, the runway asset, etc., can be used to its greatest utility. Things like the creation of a digital twin, which is a virtual image of the airport in operation at any time. So they can manage social distancing, for instance, of people. They can manage the flow of passengers through the airport in real time by watching a digital replica of the actual operation in an airport and adjusting how their resources are deployed, how many gates they've got open, where they send their teams to for various tasks and things in an airport. That's a very interesting technology.
Is that in use now in airports?
It's in use. In fact, DXC's done some extensive work in Hong Kong to prototype a digital twin over there. So they're looking at potentially up to 40% operational improvement in Hong Kong,
and that comes from optimizing resource use, optimizing personnel use,
and doing it in real time. But the data that they capture in real time, they can then use for historical analysis. So they can go back and say, well, how can we drive greater efficiency in the way the airport operates by looking at how they've performed in the past? It really gives them a huge advantage. The ability to store that sort of data, which is some of it's video data, some of it's smart sensors, etc. They've got deployed around the airport, creates very large data sets that in today's technology allows them to store them relatively cheaply and process them very, very rapidly. So they can start to predict about how the airport should operate in the future, but they can also do it real time on the day of operations to make sure the airport is operating in the most efficient way, which in a post-COVID world is going to be very important. New York, JFK has just implemented some video processing technology that helps them maintain social distancing. So they can see where passengers are dwelling, where they're getting to, dwell times are too long. They can then send out somebody to do dispersal activities and that sort of thing. It's a very interesting use of this sort of analytics.
Well, I'm hoping we'll see the end of social distancing eventually. That's. But anyway, that aside, the digital twin element is fascinating. I mean, I've really sort of seen it come up in so many different sectors. I work in the property and construction sector, and the digital twin for buildings is becoming amazing to see the sort of level of detail you can do and the scenario testing in how you construct a building. And I've sort of seen a number of applications of this in airports as well. Like I know Certis in Singapore is doing something similar with the digital twin. And I think the cost structure element of it, in terms of if we are going to face rising cost pressures in airport infrastructure or port infrastructure, technology has to be the key to fix some of the operating costs of the airport, if not the construction costs of the airport in the first place. I mean, these things aren't cheap to build, and they have very, very long lifespans. And if you have an international incident like we've got here in the pandemic, that automatically changes the structure of your airport. Yeah. How do you do that? At least with the digital twin, you can scenario test and you can play war games and that sort of thing.
Yeah, which is exactly how this sort of technology is starting to be used, and it will help them to avoid the passing on of those costs for the new infrastructure that they're going to need to deploy in a post-COVID world.
Interestingly, the McLaren racing team, I noticed, Richard, you were wearing a McLaren racing team COVID mask earlier. They also have a digital twin that's pretty cool of their car.
So when I was a CIO at Air Services, we worked with Deloitte and McLaren Racing Technology to build a digital twin of our airspace.
Wow.
It hasn't been deployed in a production sense. We've built the prototype and we've proven that it works, and Deloitte and McLaren were actually very impressed with how quickly they could do that with their technology. Really? It's fantastic.
Wow. Well, hey, Daniel Ricciardo won a race recently.
Yeah, that's right.
Go you, Daniel. Well done. So let's actually it's a good segue, really. Let's go a little bit off COVID for a bit into sort of airports. I've noticed it's one thing you do find when people talk about travel is they always seem to talk about the airport, right? Oh, look, blah blah. Airport was fantastic. This was amazing. That was amazing. I guess two questions. What is it about airports that people love? Why, isn't it a place you go somewhere else? And I guess my second question is, what, in terms of a technology sense, what's standing out for you in sort of modern airports?
I'm not sure people actually do love going to airports, do they?
I find people always like to talk. People always talk about, I went to X airport and it looked amazing. Yeah, and I really hate ALX.
Yeah, like the standout airports, the ones that have really invested in the architecture and the engineering are definitely interesting places to visit. I think if you're a business traveller and you had to go there a lot, it
would lose its luster pretty quickly.
In fact, there was some research done recently in the UK looking at pre-COVID, looking at the airline and airport experience, and the most stressful part for a passenger in terms of travel, getting from point A to point B, is getting to the airport.
Oh yes,
It's
yes,
the transport
absolutely.
you have to get to the airport, which has been a very big challenge for airports, because they don't control a lot of that infrastructure. They don't control a lot of the interruptions that create that stress. I guess if, you know...
It used to shock me that you'd have to take a 40-minute cab ride from, you know, Sydney CBD or, you know, nearby to Sydney Airport.
Yeah.
Like that would just, you know, and that was, you know, to take an 8-hour flight to Asia. It seemed crazy. Whereas, you know, in Asia, you just jump on a train and you're there.
Yeah, it depends on where you are in Asia.
You know, it depends. Sure, it depends. In the modern Asian cities, I should say.
Well, yeah, you spend a lot of time in India, and
Different scenario.
and I spent 5 hours in a taxi getting to the airport. So
I remember as a child traveling through Bombay Airport. It was not one of my favorite experiences.
yeah,
I remember. But, you know, I mean, I think some of the airports that have really struck me, that Shanghai, what they've done there with that sort of big dome in the middle of it is extraordinary.
yeah, that is an extraordinary airport architecturally. I come back to the Doha. Hamman Airport is an architectural marvel, and the engineering that's gone into that airport, they've really done a great job to blend the physical infrastructure of the airport with the digital, and so it's very non-invasive for a passenger, but a passenger is guided through that airport in a way that you don't even see the technology. You feel it's the actual architecture of the building that's helping you navigate through the airport. And I think that's a really fantastic example of an airport using technology in an intelligent way. And I can't ever sort of go past Changi. I mean, Changi is my favourite airport. And the Singaporeans are credited with coining the term Aerotropolis, which is an urban form that kind of has the airport at the centre that drives the
with the industrial base around.
With the industrial base around and that sort of thing. And they've just driven that sort of model really, really well. And Changi Airport, for me, is the most stress-free environment. And I never have a bad experience in Changi. I never ever feel crowded in Changi. And the bags are always on time. You know, the process through immigration or emigration is always seamless and simple, even though they haven't really got their biometrics working yet, which is just being implemented now. And the other one, I think that my other favourite airport of mine is Hong Kong, for a very similar reason. You know, it's a airport city, and they've done a lot of work to invest in the way that technology integrates seamlessly with the physical infrastructure of the airport.
Love that you could check your bag in at the station and it would arrive in Sydney.
Yeah.
At the train station.
Yeah.
Like the Airport Express, and that was well ahead of its time, right?
What was fantastic. In fact, the Hong Kong Airport Authority is doing some really fantastic stuff at the moment in terms of maintaining health standards. They've implemented a channel, and they're only using it for staff at the moment, but they think that they'll use it for passengers in the future, which sterilises. As you walk down, it uses ultraviolet light to sterilise people, and so they use it for their staff that are working in the airport environment to make sure that they're clean and it's hygienic. The other really innovative thing I've seen there at Hong Kong is they're using robots to do cleaning. So these little robots go around, they clean the toilets, they clean all the public areas, they sterilise everything using ultraviolet and air purifiers and things. And I think that's a really, really clever, innovative use of technology in an airport context.
Well, again, it changes your whole personnel dynamics as well, right?
Yeah.
If you're, because again, airport security, airport hygiene, you can go on and on. I think that's, for me, Hong Kong and Sydney were my two favourite airports because they were both home. Yeah. My parents were there and, I lived here, so they were always my favourite.
Yeah, Sydney's always great to come home to. That's fantastic.
I must say, though, with Changi, the airport economics are fascinating in the sense that they pioneered, and I think the Hong Kong Chinese did as well, the fact that you should be entertained at the airport while you are there. So you can do some shopping, you can visit some type of tourism attractivity. Like they've got that sort of garden upstairs that you can go to. There's a video game centre. It's a very interactive sort of airport.
It's an experience.
It's an experience. That's the word I was looking for, right? It's not a place, it's not like an airport, like I will use Bombay again, which is not, it's a different type of experience, a very different reason. it is and I think that the economics of the airport have become fascinating, and the technology overlay of that becomes fascinating as well, in terms of, well, if the airport's an experience and it's designed to be attracted to, then how do you manage that in a post-pandemic world, I think is fascinating. I want to go back quickly to one thing we were talking about earlier, which was, and you mentioned it, and I said I'd come back to it, was if it's really advanced on one side and not advanced on the other, then you end up with this sort of global inequity, really, don't you? You have a situation where, you're safe and secure, you're completely sterilized, you're biometrically secured, and then you arrive somewhere else where you're back to your paper passport and, manual temperature checking. Do you think that creates some type of global inequity there? Is there a problem with that? Is that a problem?
It's been a problem for the industry since its inception. And it's difficult because it depends on nations being at a level of interoperability from a technology perspective and a process and training perspective. There are three primary committees or organisations that oversee this. The first one is the International Civil Aviation Organisation, which is a subcommittee of the United Nations, ICAO. And ICAO sort of governs, it's not a regulator, and it doesn't overrule national sovereign rules and regulations, but they try to manage the harmonisation of air traffic across the globe. They try to make sure that everybody's at a level where air transportation can be safe and reliable. And that often means having a level of interoperability and technical capability that poorer nations struggle with. And they have an initiative called No Country Left Behind. And that means that the way that they're driving the technology innovation and the technology development for aviation is ensuring that poorer nations can be brought along that journey, and that interoperability isn't impacted by their level of investment that those poorer nations can make. Now the problem is that causes a lag, because the advanced nations are able to invest in modern advanced technologies much quicker than the poorer nations, and it takes a while for that to catch up. So that lag does generate a bit of an issue. The second organisation that's involved here is the International Aviation Air Transportation Organisation, IATA, and they represent the airlines. And what they do is they try to ensure that each of the national states don't implement regulations and rules that penalise the airlines, and they work with the airports and ICAO as well. And the third one is the Airport Council International, ACI, and they represent the airports and the airport interests, and they work with ICAO and IATA and other governments, etc., to try and harmonise the way the rules work, and so that we've got a fairly good chance that if you're departing an airport in Australia and landing in an airport somewhere in Asia or Europe or the US, that experience will be relatively similar. And they do that by negotiating with the various parties and stakeholders in the aviation industry to try and harmonise those processes.
Wow.
It's an imperfect system, but it's definitely a focus for the industry, and they've been trying to get this.
Well, now that you mention it, though, it is a pretty similar experience at the moment on each side.
Yeah.
There are differences, obviously, but there is a similar experience. You go through, you know what to expect, right?
Yeah.
You turn up, you check in, you go through airport security, you're scanned, you're patted down, you're whatever, and then you get on plane and leave, right?
Yep.
That's pretty standardized,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
So I didn't realize that there was that much. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that there's that much infrastructure behind it. So you think that will get us through this next phase?
So they're very focused on it. Those three organisations have, if you go to their website, the big COVID banner appears on every single one of them.
Yeah.
They are very focused on this because going back to the original comments we made about the industry, it's making a massive loss. It's probably the most impacted industry by COVID. So those representative organisations are very, very focused on making sure that we come out of this crisis and the airline industry can recover as quickly as possible with the greatest chance of returning to some sort of profitability.
Here. I think I would love to see it. I mean, the amount of airlines that have gone through bailouts, and I noticed Lufthansa just did a cap raising the other day. Cathay Pacific has done one. It is just a very, very difficult time for everybody in the aviation industry. And look, most industries have suffered, right? But you'd have to say being grounded by a health pandemic for anyone in the sort of tourism, airport, airline sector has been difficult. It's been a fascinating conversation. We'll have to end soon.
Yep.
But normally I sort of like to say, well, what are 3 things you think are going to happen? So I'm going to ask you to predict. So we're coming out of the pandemic. In order for us to really do this properly and make sure that we come back as an industry from an infrastructure and aviation perspective, what are 3 things you think we need to do?
So one of the first things is we have to get the biometrics working in a global perspective. It's not going to work very well if you can be biometrically efficient in your home airport and then have to get out your paper passport and your paper documentation at your arriving airport. So IATA is doing a lot of work in that area on an initiative called One ID, which includes biometric facial recognition, matching with identities, and vaccination status in a single product. So I think that's a very interesting.
And vaccination status.
Yes.
Interesting.
And they're working with all nations. So they're going to implement a system that will work with all of the nations, the 193 nations that are.
It's going to bring in vaccine recognition, isn't it? That's going to be fascinating.
It's going to be fascinating. And if you don't have a vaccine, then you're going to have some sort of test status. So this system will allow that.
So you might be tested as negative.
Yes.
That might be right.
Yeah. So I think that's the biggest one. The second one, I think, is that experience that a customer will have in the airport, where they won't be touching things. They will have a fairly seamless and frictionless flow through an airport, and that has to happen because we've got to make sure that we're compliant to the various health regulations and rules, etc., and try to give them that experience where they and build their confidence that they can come to an airport, leave an airport, and arrive at another airport and have that a similar experience
and be safe and feel safe.
And feel safe.
Yeah, I think that's a big one, isn't
and
it?
secure. Yeah. And I think then the third one is, to the discussion we had before about the economics of all this is all going to cost money, and the airports need to start to invest in some of these new technologies that allow them to operate much more efficiently, and not pass as much of this cost on to the flying passengers, because at the end of the day that constrains the demand and has a flow-on impact to the industry as well. So I think they're the 3 things: the biometrics, the contactless, and the operational efficiency are the sort of things that we'll see happening in airports in the next few years.
Well, I think that's a fantastic summary of where we're at, and I think it's been a great time to be talking about this as we get ready to open up and start traveling again. Chris Seller, thank you so much for being part of the Smarter Cities podcast.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Smarter Cities. Please do subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or LinkedIn. Leave us a rating, it always helps. And tell your friends about us on social media. Intro and outro music is by Bruno E. at Public Memory. We are produced by Social Titanium out of New York. Check him out at socialtitanium.co.